They told you the dates. They told you the names. But they left out the truth. From royal scandals buried for centuries, to covert operations that almost rewrote the map of the world, history's juiciest, strangest, and most dangerous moments were never in your textbook. Which one do you think they kept hidden on purpose? Drop your guess in the comments before you find out. When you picture the path to the U.S. presidency, you probably imagine decades of political grooming, long campaigns, and a nation's deliberate choice. But in 1881, the United States ended up with a president who was never supposed to be anywhere, near the Oval Office. His name was Chester A. Arthur, and his rise to power was the result of a gunshot, a scandal, and a series of events so bizarre that historians still shake their heads at it. At the time, Arthur was the vice president under James A. Garfield, but he hadn't been picked for his leadership skills. In fact, Arthur was widely seen as a political pawn, a representative of the corrupt New York political machine led by Roscoe Conkling. Many Americans believed he was unfit for any serious office, let alone the presidency. Then, on July 2, 1881, tragedy struck. President Garfield was shot by Charles J. Guiteau, a disgruntled office seeker. At a train station in Washington, D.C., Garfield survived the initial attack, but infection set in, and after 79 agonizing days, he died. Suddenly, Chester A. Arthur, the man nicknamed the Gentleman Boss for his comfortable ties to corruption, was sworn in as the 21st President of the United States. The public was horrified. Newspapers openly questioned whether the shooter had been in league with Arthur's political allies. There were rumors that Arthur himself was relieved to see Garfield gone, as it secured him the highest office in the land. But here's the twist your history teacher might not have told you. Once in office, Arthur shocked the nation by turning against the very machine that put him there. Instead of rewarding his political cronies, he championed civil service reform, the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which aimed to dismantle the spoils system and ensure government jobs were awarded based on merit, not political favors. It was a bold and unexpected move that alienated his old allies, but earned him a newfound respect from the public. Why the sudden change of heart? Some historians believe Arthur's own mortality influenced him. During his presidency, he discovered he was suffering from Bright's disease, a kidney ailment that would eventually kill him. Knowing his time was short, Arthur may have sought to leave behind a legacy that would be remembered for integrity rather than corruption. He served just one term, choosing not to run for re-election. When he left office, his approval ratings were far higher than when he entered. Even Mark Twain, who had once mocked Arthur as a creature of the machine, admitted that he had been a man of fair and honorable mind. But the strangest part, after Arthur's death in 1886, his political papers and personal correspondence were almost entirely destroyed, burned by his son. Historians to this day don't know what secrets might have been lost in those flames. It's a reminder that sometimes the people we least expect can rise to the occasion, and that history's biggest surprises often come from the figures we've underestimated the most. History books often present monarchies as symbols of tradition, stability, and carefully arranged alliances. But in 1936, the British monarchy was nearly brought to its knees by a love story that defied every expectation and nearly destroyed the crown. It began with Edward VIII, a charismatic and popular figure who had only just become king after the death of his father, George V. From the start, Edward seemed different from his predecessors. He was informal, modern, and not afraid to break with tradition. But there was a problem. A big one. Edward had fallen in love with Wallis Simpson, an American socialite. Not only was she a foreigner, but she was also twice divorced, and at the time, divorce was a scandal in Britain's high society, especially for the head of the Church of England. The British establishment panicked. Politicians, clergy, and the royal household agreed. A king could not marry a divorced woman and remain on the throne. Rumors swirled in the press, though British newspapers largely suppressed the full details to protect the crown. But outside Britain, especially in the U.S., the story was front-page news. Behind closed doors, Edward was given an ultimatum: choose the throne or the woman he loved. What came next was unprecedented. On December 11, 1936, Edward VIII announced his abdication in a live radio broadcast, telling the nation, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king without the help and support of the woman I love." In just 325 days, Edward's reign was over, the shortest of any British monarch in history. His younger brother became King George VI, and the course of British history changed forever. But here's the part your history teacher might have skipped. Edward's exile was not just about love. Documents declassified decades later revealed that British intelligence had concerns about Edward and Wallace's political sympathies, specifically their alleged closeness to Nazi Germany. In 1940, during World War II, the couple even met with Adolf Hitler. While the true nature of their relationship with the Nazi regime remains debated, the rumors were strong enough that Winston Churchill arranged to have Edward appointed governor of the Bahamas, a posting that kept him far from Europe for most of the war. To the public, the story remained one of romance, a king giving up everything for love. But behind the scenes, it was also about power, politics, and the image of the monarchy during a time when Britain was facing one of its darkest hours. Edward and Wallis married in France in 1937, living the rest of their lives mostly abroad. They were never allowed to return to Britain in any official capacity, and Wallis was never granted the title of Her Royal Highness. The abdication crisis had lasting consequences. It paved the way for Queen Elizabeth II's reign, reshaped public expectations of the monarchy, and left an enduring lesson. Sometimes, the biggest events in history are not battles or treaties, but deeply personal choices made in private. As for Edward and Wallis, they remained together until his death in 1972. Whether theirs was a grand romance or a political liability disguised as one is still debated by historians. But one thing is certain: their love story changed the course of the British crown forever. In the summer of 1939, Europe stood on the edge of catastrophe. Adolf Hitler had already annexed Austria and swallowed Czechoslovakia. The next target was clear: Poland. The world was bracing for war. But what many people don't know is that just weeks before the invasion, Hitler received a letter that could have changed everything. The sender? Not a politician, not a general, but Mahatma Gandhi. Yes, the same Gandhi who led India's struggle for independence through nonviolent resistance, tried to stop Hitler with a personal appeal. The letter, dated December 24, 1940, and preceded by an earlier one in 1939, began with the startling words, "Dear friend." Gandhi went on to urge Hitler to avoid war and to use his power for peace, calling violence the most degrading thing in human life. He warned that history would judge him harshly if he continued down his path. The tone was almost shockingly polite, even affectionate, not the condemnation you might expect. Gandhi believed that appealing to Hitler's humanity, rather than confronting him with threats, might spark a change. But here's the twist: the British government intercepted the letter before it could be delivered. At the time, India was still under British colonial rule, and officials feared that direct communication between Gandhi and Hitler could be politically embarrassing. The idea of one of Britain's most troublesome colonial subjects negotiating with Europe's most dangerous dictator was unthinkable to them. So, the message sat in government files undelivered. Hitler never read it, Would it have made any difference? Most historians believe not. Hitler's ambitions were far too entrenched by then. But others argue that, at that moment, Hitler was still calculating his moves carefully. A direct appeal from a globally respected figure like Gandhi might have, at the very least, introduced a hesitation or altered his propaganda narrative. What's even stranger is that Gandhi wasn't alone in reaching out to Hitler. Several prominent figures, including American industrialists and religious leaders, tried to send messages urging peace. Some were answered with icy silence. Others received curt dismissals. The tragedy is that while letters like Gandhi's were being intercepted, Europe's diplomats were frantically negotiating pacts, alliances, and ultimatums that were already too late. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. The world would be plunged into 6 years of bloodshed. Tens of millions would die. And Gandhi's dear friend letter became one of history's strangest and most tragic what-ifs. Today, the intercepted letter sits in archives as a curiosity, a reminder of both the limits of moral persuasion and the power of gatekeepers to alter history. It's also a testament to Gandhi's belief that even the darkest hearts might be reached by appeals to conscience, if only the words could find their way to them. It was the summer of 1939, and war was a shadow creeping across Europe. In Poland, officials knew that the country's gold reserves, worth hundreds of millions in today's money, were in danger. If the Nazis invaded, those reserves would be one of the first things they seized. So, in a daring and desperate move, the Polish government hatched Operation Peking, a secret plan to move the gold out of the country before the first German tank crossed the border. But here's the problem. Moving nearly 80 tons of gold bars in an era before modern air cargo wasn't exactly easy. Trucks could be intercepted, trains could be bombed, ships could be sunk, and the Nazis had spies everywhere. The operation began under cover of darkness. Convoys loaded with wooden crates, labeled as machine parts to avoid suspicion, slipped out of Warsaw. Guards in plain clothes escorted them, pretending to be ordinary workers. The gold traveled by truck to the city of Poznań, then onto the Vistula River, where barges carried it further toward the border. Every movement was a gamble. Every stop was a potential disaster. From there, the gold crossed into Romania. But not without drama. At the border, Romanian officials hesitated, fearing that allowing such a transfer could drag their neutral country into trouble with Germany. After tense negotiations and some discreet payments, the gold was allowed to pass. The next leg of the journey took it to the port of Constanta, where it was loaded onto ships bound for Istanbul, Turkey. The voyage was fraught with danger. German submarines patrolled the waters, and Allied warships were on high alert. One wrong move and the gold would be lost forever. From Istanbul, the shipment continued to Beirut, then across the Mediterranean to Toulon, France. By the time the gold reached France, Hitler's armies were already advancing west. Here's where the story takes a twist your history teacher probably never told you. When Germany invaded France in 1940, the gold once again had to be moved. This time, it traveled across the Atlantic to Dakar in West Africa, and from there to Canada. By the end of the war, the gold had circled half the globe, and remarkably, not a single bar was lost. The success of Operation Peking remains one of the most astonishing feats of wartime logistics. It was a high-stakes cat-and-mouse game played across continents, with every country involved calculating its own risks and rewards. And yet, for decades after the war, the Polish government's gold was not fully returned. Disputes over wartime, debts, shifting alliances, and Cold War politics meant that the treasure remained scattered in vaults across multiple nations. Only in recent decades has much of it been repatriated. It's a story of courage, secrecy, and sheer determination. And it reminds us that wars aren't just fought with bullets and bombs. They're also fought with ledgers, shipping manifests, and the nerve to move unimaginable wealth under the noses of enemies. In the chaos of World War II, alliances shifted like sand in the wind. Enemies became friends, friends became enemies, and sometimes, just sometimes, bitter foes struck deals that defied every rule of war. One of the strangest of these was the German-Soviet Commercial Agreement of 1940. Yes, you read that right. Less than a year before Germany invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, the two nations were not only at peace, they were trading partners. The roots of this bizarre cooperation lay in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the infamous non-aggression treaty signed in August 1939. Publicly, it promised peace between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Secretly, it divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, paving the way for the joint invasion and partition of Poland. But after carving up Poland, the two sides went even further. In February 1940, they signed a commercial deal. The Soviet Union would send Germany massive quantities of raw materials, grain, oil, timber, and most crucially, manganese ore and phosphates needed for weapon production. In exchange, Germany sent the Soviets machinery, industrial equipment, and even military technology. It was a chilling dance of convenience. Stalin knew that Germany was gearing up for war in the West, and the Soviets saw an opportunity to modernize their industries. Hitler, meanwhile, understood that without Soviet resources, his war machine could grind to a halt. And so, while German U-boats sank British ships in the Atlantic, Soviet trains rumbled westward with supplies for the very nation Britain was fighting. The scale was staggering. Between 1940 and mid-1941, the Soviet Union shipped Germany over 1 million tons of grain, 900,000 tons of oil, and thousands of tons of other vital goods. In return, the Soviets received factory equipment, electrical systems, and even the blueprints for a battleship. The strangest part of all? Even as this trade was happening, both sides were secretly planning to destroy each other. Soviet intelligence knew that Germany was massing troops near the border. German generals were already drafting invasion plans. The trains full of oil and steel rolled in one direction, while troop trains rolled in the other. On June 22, 1941, the fragile illusion shattered. Germany launched the largest invasion in human history, sending over 3 million soldiers into the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa had begun. The trade stopped overnight. All those Soviet shipments had, in hindsight, fueled the very tanks that were now roaring east. Historians still debate whether Stalin truly believed Hitler would honor their agreement, or whether he was simply buying time. Some argue that Stalin miscalculated, convinced that Hitler wouldn't risk a two-front war until Britain was defeated. Others believe Stalin saw the deal as a trap for Germany, only to be caught in it himself. In the end, the German-Soviet Commercial Agreement stands as one of the most surreal episodes in modern history. For 16 months, two of the most ideologically opposed regimes in history, one fascist, one communist, cooperated with cold, pragmatic efficiency. It's a reminder that in the brutal game of geopolitics, principles often take a backseat to survival, until the knives come out. Sometimes, the most unbelievable parts of history are the ones hidden between the headlines. They're the secret deals, the vanishing treasures, and the impossible escapes your textbooks never mentioned. History isn't just dates and names. It's human choices, strange twists, and moments where everything could have gone differently. Which of these stories surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments, and let's see which hidden piece of history our community crowns as the most mind-blowing.